All right, so welcome back. We're now going to the second part of the Heilbronner reading. So, in the first part, we discussed the economic problem, and it consists of answering three economic questions: what to produce, how to produce it, and how to distribute what is produced. So these questions have been relevant for every society at any time and place, as we discussed before, because answering them well is a precondition for social and material production and reproduction. So the question now in the second part is how have different societies answered these questions over time? And historically, we can observe three types or three ways in which societies have answered this question. So, the ways, these three types, we call economic systems. So, the first economic system that we can observe historically is tradition. So, for most of our human history, we have addressed those questions through tradition. So, how does that look like? So, in tradition, societies normally will answer questions of distribution and production through social ties, through a process of trial and error, right? That will be based on, for example, some combination of gender, age, and kinship. So the social rules and codes of behavior are the ones that are going to determine the division of labor. So who does what, right? How to produce. And then the distribution of the social outcome, or sorry, the social output. So who gets what? Okay. So as I said, it is a combination of age, gender, and kinship that will determine who does what and who gets what. So, for example, the young uh, children take care of small animals and take care of a few home plants that are grown around the community. The women take care of the big animals and they collect fruits and other kinds of vegetables in the forest. And then the men are responsible for hunting and making some hunting, fishing, right? Um, Getting the game for the community. So that's kind of how the division of labor is determined, and similarly, the distribution of the output. Now, we can ask ourselves if these societies look very different than ours, right? And of course, in some sense, it does look very different. But economists like to maybe look at some similarities. So, for example, was there any exchange? Was there any markets in this kind of economic systems? And the answer is that although there were no markets, there were different forms of exchange. So a lot of the exchange was based on reciprocity and a mutual gift giving. And the way it worked was that whenever some family had some extra game or extra crops that they collect, they would give to their neighbors or to another community that was close by. And this gift imposed on the recipient a sort of obligation to pay back at some point in time, right? So You know that saying, gifts make friends and friends make gifts, right? So that's the idea here. So it worked in a certain way as an insurance system. So it was like, wow, this year our crops went really well. We are going to give some to our neighbors, right? But then if next year things are not looking very good, we rely on the neighbors and other communities to help us out. So in that sense, it worked as an insurance system. Now, this idea that we have some left over, right? The crop went really well. Economists call it the surplus. Okay, so the surplus is the production above and beyond just what it takes to reproduce your family, your community, or society in general. Okay, and this can include a surplus of labor, a surplus of natural resources, or a surplus of capital, right? So now let's suppose that we're dealing with a society that only produces one type of output, corn, okay? And let's suppose that their output equals 10,000 bushels of corn per year. Out of these 10,000 bushels of corn, 1,000 is used as seed, so that we need to replace the corn seeds every year in order to keep having that output of 10,000 over and over again, right? So 1,000 is used as natural input, as seed, for the production of our output. And then another 80,000 units of corn are used to feed the population or to reproduce the labor force. Okay, so we can talk about this 8,000 as the input, the cost of input of our labor resources. All right. So then if we look at these numbers, we have 10,000 bushels of corn as output, then 80,000 we use as for labor input, and 1,000 as natural input. So then the total inputs for us to keep producing and reproducing ourselves equals 9,000 bushels of corn. Okay? So then when we look at the difference between our output and our input, so our output is 10,000, input is 9,000. When we look at that difference, we see that we have a corn surplus that equals 1,000 bushels of corn. So this means that, again, the definition of the surplus is whatever output is left over after we replace all the inputs that were used in production, right? So now with the surplus, we can do whatever we want. Okay, we can redistribute it out through the community. We can use for harvest feasts in order to celebrate how well our crop collection was. We can trade, we can give them to our neighbors as a reciprocity, right? A social insurance network. So there are different uses or possible uses for the surplus. Now, let's say that one year the elders of the committee decide to use part of the surplus and add some corn to the corn bin, okay, to the seed bin. So let's say out of the 1,000 bushels of corn surplus, 100 is used as seed. Okay? Technology stays the same, the size of the population stays the same, and now instead of only using 1,000 bushels of corn for seed, we use 1,100 bushels of corn for seed. And that means that our output is going to increase. So instead of now 10,000, we produce in a year 11,000 bushels of corn. So what happened here? How do economists call that process? So what we see here is that as we increase our input, we're going to have more output and more surplus. Okay? And in that sense, we are now the surplus is larger, okay? And we have more corn in order to decide what to do with it. Trade with our friends, redistribute it through the community, have a bigger feast. But so what is happening here? In modern terms, what is happening is that the increase, using the surplus to increase the size of inputs is called investment. Okay, so that's whenever we use the surplus as reproducible or productive as we use the surplus as productive input, we call it investment. Okay, and when there is a higher output resulting from more inputs, it's called economic growth. And then the surplus are the profits. Okay, so this is the idea. In order for us to grow as an economy, we need to have a surplus and use that surplus as investment, right? Buying productive inputs.